Well, firstly, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's wonderful to be here. It's my first time in Malaysia, so it's an honor. I came for this conference on Islamophobia studies happening later this week. And since I was coming from so far away in Canada, I thought I should spend a few more days in Malaysia. And I'm very grateful to Pemikir, to all of you for coming, and especially to Amir Ashraf for organizing this and inviting me. It's a real pleasure, and I'm very curious and excited to hear your comments and feedback, because I've gained a sense that there is a lot of ideas. It's a vibrant community for Islamic intellectual pursuits in Kuala Lumpur, and I'd like to connect with that and learn from you as well. So the topic that I'm speaking about today is Sufism and the political. So it's Islamicate history and anti-colonial resistance. And I want to start by remembering two anti-colonial thinkers from the middle of the 20th century that should be recognizable to anybody who's interested in decolonization studies or in anti-colonial intellectuals. One, of course, is the famous Frantz Fanon, who wrote The Wretched of the Earth and other works of significance and importance. And the other person is somebody who he met in France when he was studying there after returning to Iran, who was involved with the translation of The Wretched of the Earth from French into Farsi. And that is, of course, Dr. Ali Shariati. So there is something purporting to be correspondence between the two. Now, some scholars have said that perhaps this was not actually a trade of letters between the two, but it was a kind of literary form in which Dr. Ali Shariati, who had become very familiar with Frantz Fanon's ideas, kind of created it to be a dialogue to elucidate certain ideas that he had. We don't know. It's still an open scholarly question about whether these are a real correspondence or whether it's Dr. Ali Shariati's interpretation of how to engage with a secular Western anti-colonial discourse and theory from the position as a Muslim intellectual and scholar in all the things that he did. Of course, his sociological, economic kinds of inspiration to how to interpret Islam for contemporary solutions to a non-anti-imperialist, independent and sovereign Muslim kind of being in the world, right? So I won't say that this is definitely Frantz Fanon's words. It's possible that they are, but they're very interesting. Let's read it. I'm excerpting from a few passages within this letter that is supposed to be from Frantz Fanon to Dr. Ali Shariati. The world of Islam has fought against the West and colonialism more than all Asia and all Africa. And although I do not feel the same way towards it as you, he's a secular, Marxist, psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist. Although I do not feel the same way towards you, I would like to emphasize more than you do yourself your remark that Islam harbors more than any other social powers of ideological alternatives in the Third World, or with your permission, the Near and Middle East, both an anti-colonialist capacity and an anti-Western character. He goes on, I hope that your authentic intellectuals may make good use of the immense cultural and social resources harbored in Muslim societies and minds with the aim of emancipation and the founding of another humanity and another civilization, and breathe this spirit in the weary body of the Muslim Orient. Nevertheless, I think that reviving sectarian and religious mindsets could impede this necessary unification, already difficult enough to attain, and divert that nation yet to come, which is at best a nation in becoming, from its ideal future, bringing it instead closer to its past. Okay, it's a very interesting quote, and there might be a little bit of Orientalism in it too, breathing the weary Muslim body, right, of the Ummah, like breathe back that spirit. But there are also some very interesting observations and ideas here that I think are very appropriate for our current time to remember. This is written in the 60s. We still have as yet that nation, that ummah, to really come into full being in its potential capacity. We're still wrestling with these same problems. We are still wrestling, I would say, unfortunately, with ideas that progress have to be in the Western frame, and we haven't taken this advice, even if it's framed by a Western thinker, of rejecting the colonialist mentality in all its forms and being confident that Islam provides the resources for, as he says, another humanity and another civilization. And if you remember, if you've read The Wretched of the Earth, that the last chapter, the epilogue, is about the hope for a new person, a new man, a new human, let's say, that should come into being that is not dependent on the sick and corrupted and violent and genocidal colonial Western idea of the human, but that an alternative has to come to free humanity. And here he's saying, or Shariati is saying, one of them is saying, Islam provides resources for that. And that we need to look back in our own tradition, our own history, and bring it into full capacity in engaging with modern questions. Not so that we return in a romantic way to the past, but that it is a vital, living source of knowledge for us today. And that there will be challenges to that. And one of the biggest challenges is sectarianism, okay? That we have to, about this identitarian question. Because if there is any hope for Islam to provide this alternative, it is because it addresses itself to the universal condition of human beings and is open for everyone. And that doesn't even mean that everyone has to convert. If we look at Islamicate history, Islam did not impose itself. Like you all know the Quranic verse, La ikraha fid din, there's no compulsion in religion. What Islam is there to present is an image of society based on certain values, a system of some kind for justice and equality and respect of certain dignity of the human. So it doesn't mean everyone has to convert and become Muslim in order to share in and participate, which is why I talk about Islamicate history, because Muslim history, or the history of Muslims, has never been one that was apart from other religions and religious difference in cosmopolitan, pluralistic, and mixed societies from its beginning, even in the time of Medina, of the Prophet ﷺ, all the way to the contemporary period. So this is something that inspires the kind of approach that I'm interested in thinking about. And so I want to say that when we come from this broad general kind of question, the other kind of interest that I have these days in particular is thinking about the relationship between religion and anti-imperial or anti-colonial resistance. Now, this to me seems unavoidable, although there are quarters on maybe the secular left or the Western left or the secularized, westernized left in the Eastern countries of never crediting religion, and particularly Islam, with being a genuine contribution to progressive freedom of people from anti-imperialism, from colonialism, and so forth. But I think during the last 2.5 years, it is impossible to avoid recognizing that the Palestinians in Gaza relied upon their faith and the determination that it gave them for their resistance. Not only the Islamic resistance that is directly confronting Israeli occupation, but the people themselves have relied upon their religion for their sumud, for this idea of persisting on the land against a settler colonizing force that wants to dispossess them of the land. They have insisted that they will continue to live and survive on their land. And one of the resources that has been so important for them is, of course, their faith. And I include also Christians among it. We have people like Mundar, Ishaq, wonderful kind of Christian, Protestant, Palestinian scholar who's written enormously compelling about the anti-colonial character of Palestinian society against settler colonialism. But of course, we are in this context very concerned with the Islamic character of this resistance and the fact that it has been so important for the Palestinian people. Impossible to ignore. You've seen the videos as well. People whose families, they've been slaughtered in a bombardment and they say, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, right? So this is an undeniable factor. The other thing that's of course important during this period and of course in the moment that we're in the last couple of months, with the kind of Israeli attempted invasion and attack upon southern Lebanon, started, of course, with the US and Israeli attack upon Iran, is to understand and think that to think about this axis of resistance that has come to continue to contest and confront imperialism, Western imperialism in West Asia, with a goal potentially, if possible, of decolonizing the region from the US bases and, of course, the settler colony, right? But what's interesting is, apart from the Palestinians, the members of the axis of resistance, the sub-state movements, and of course Iran itself, are led by a Shi'i Muslim coalition. Now, there may be, in Yemen, there are many Sunnis who are part of Ansarullah. It's not only Shiism, but it's led by and inspired by a revolutionary Shi'i theology that they are using to frame the way in which they make meaningful their continued resistance and the resource that they develop that allows them to consider the huge sacrifices that have to be made and suffered in order to continue to resist against US imperialism, against Israeli settler colonialism. So they are using this language, the language of sacrifice that comes from the martyrdom of Imam Husain in Karbala, for example, right? And we know that, for example, gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the general, General Qasim Soleimani, who was martyred in Iraq, said that of his country, Iran, we are the nation of Imam Hussein, right? So they identify that this is fundamental to how they're looking at the world. And what I would say is that this is Shiism, but it is revolutionary Shiism that has happened and reframed many of the concepts, many of the episodes historically in kind of Shi'i sacred history, the way they look at the past and all of that, within a new frame because of this, the revolution that established the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is not the Shiism of 18th century, right? Or even maybe 19th century. Something has changed. And so we have to take note of that, and I'll come back to this kind of point. You know, so we've seen, for example, the millions manifest defiance after the Minab massacre, the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. We've seen how important it is a part of the Shi'i devotional culture, the liturgy, and so on. Now, as I said, this is something kind of new of the last 40 years, historically speaking, in terms of the long history of, you know, what Shi'i devotional culture was like. That there used to be thought of that the waiting for the Imam, the Mahdi, the hidden Imam, the Mahdi, at the end of time, right, to come, was a pacifying kind of orientation, and that they were quietist. So when the Islamic Revolution happened, many people, their idea of what Shiism was and who Shi'is were, it surprised them very much. And my teacher at UC Berkeley, Dr. Hamid Algar, was among the only ones who recognized the revolutionary potential. He wrote an article in the late 1960s where he said that there will, you know, if there's going to be a kind of social and political revolution against the Shah's regime, it will come by being led by Shi'i ulama. Everyone thought this was crazy, didn't make sense, but he had studied the Qajar ulama during the Constitutional Revolution, and he had been paying attention to what was happening. People like Dr. Ali Shariati, people like Imam Khomeini and others, many other ayatollahs, and so he thought this is how it will happen. But that was because it confounded the stereotypes about Shiism, that they are passive quietists waiting at the end of time for the Mahdi to come. So no struggle now. The political engagement is unnecessary. Now we wait for the Imam to come, right? That was how they were understood. But something changed, and it became a radical revolutionary, moving from passive intizar, waiting, to an active intizar. That you participate in creating the conditions to prepare yourselves for the coming of the Mahdi, right? So they transformed something that had been a passive element of their theology into an active element of struggle. This shows you something very important, that whatever phase, it's not intrinsic necessarily to the theology, it is how that theology engages with the history. That's why I want to come to the question here of, this has led to the question, what's wrong with Sunni Islam? What has happened to the Sunnis, right? It used to be that the Sunnis, like the late 19th century, all these anti-imperialist movements, Islamism, the modernist Islam that confronted imperialism, all the way from, reformists that, tried to change their society in Egypt and developing this Muslim Brotherhood, and that was the Sunni was the active, component, because they had a tradition of politics and rule, right? They weren't the minority, they were a majority, they had governed Muslim society, so it seemed natural that these movements then would be taking the historical character of the political. And there were movements that were attempting to do that, right? We know that about that. So the question is now, why is it that this is a very quiet sort of, kind of period? We may feel as Sunnis very great solidarity with the Palestinians suffering. Universally, everyone feels that anywhere you go in the Muslim world. However, it has not led to effective confrontation, right? So this has become a question that people were asking, and you could see that there was also attraction to the resistance that is being shown by the Palestinians, but also by this Shi'i axis of resistance that then Sunnis have had to try and respond a little bit to. And we were chatting, corresponding a little bit before, and you had Imam Tom Fashin here, and he recently did a 4-part series on Sunni-Shi'i relations and talking about Iran and all of that. And what I would say is this replicated the warning of Fanon, that there are temptations to fall into sectarian thinking, even if it was for the best of motives. We have to clarify, there's some good things. At this moment, during the war with Iran, to have revived, we have to be very clear about the differences and what they did wrong and all of this. It's a discourse that doesn't contribute to activating Sunnis to also say, hey, we have a responsibility as well to confront, to be in solidarity, and we must support our Muslim brothers who are actually waging the war. We cannot do the war. Okay, that's one thing. But the position to take is that, everyone's looking and admiring the inspiring example of these heroic people, millions coming into the street saying, we will resist America, we don't care if you drop bombs on us. This is impressive to all Muslims with a feeling for solidarity for the Palestinians, for our brothers in Iran. The discourse of trying to emphasize Sunni-Shia relations in the way that it's often done is trying to respond to the fact that people have a natural inclination and they're trying to manage that. And that's one technique. I would argue what we should be doing is looking to where are the sources within Sunni tradition, ourselves, that could activate us to contribute something to this ummah and its, discourse and against colonialism and empire. So, unfortunately, we have on the other side, the only forces that have been active and mobilized are these very takfiri-oriented groups that have actually, I would argue, and we'll come to this, served, imperialist and colonialist designs in the region. So this is a problem. We have to consider, how do we repair this situation and improve our relationship to a real Islamic solidarity, right? And so very often this is looked at, is it a question of theology versus history? Okay, I just gave you the example of quietist Shiism, right? If that's the theology, it is theology, but it's theology interpreted in light of history, in light of contemporary circumstances, that you activate it for and interpret it to give you a pathway, right? The theology doesn't stay static. Religion, religious identity, it doesn't stay static. It's such a wide and encompassing truth that it has to reflect. Just think about it this way, I would say, is that we emphasize different components of our tradition and our resources to be of use and benefit in the circumstances we find ourselves. So it doesn't falsify that you might, for the Shii example, wait for the Mahdi. But you could interpret and understand and say, but I have a role to do now, right? So likewise, what would we see in our tradition as a possibility, so that we don't think that it's a question of theology, that Sunnis theologically just don't have. Well, most of the history has been Sunnis being active in governance, so what has happened, I mean, I'm not going to talk about so much about what has happened. We can discuss that a little further, but I'll come to this and then we'll take a break for any, questions, and then we'll go into examples. But what I want to say is that one contributing factor, besides the sectarianism and the kind of takfiri sort of orientation in some parts of Sunni movements, is that there has been a hiding or a suppressing or a misunderstanding in modernist Islamic movements of the tradition of anti-colonialist jihad, which is a major factor that is rooted in tasawwuf, in the history of the Sufi orders. And so just as we think today that Sufi spirituality is quietist, which is why in the West, during the global war on terror, when they created the division between the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, is that they thought, oh, Sufis are quietists, they're otherworldly, they don't pay attention to politics, they're apolitical, those are the good Muslims. And we will support and, promote that kind of an Islam because it will be depoliticizing of Muslims, right? Because that's the danger, is the Muslim as a political subject is the great danger as far as the West is concerned, right? So this was seen as how were they able to do that is because the very idea of Sufism has been to convince us that it is a spirituality as which is a Western construct. And I would recommend that we need to reorient Sufism back to its historic possibilities from the past to be inspired for a future, which is what Fanon said, is that, don't be just romanticizing the past, but, use this tradition, or Shariati said, use this tradition to achieve the future that we're looking for, right? So I want to stop for a moment there because I've been going on for a while, but I will then come to talking about this problem of the spiritualization, what that means of Sufism, and then give us a counter history of that. But I want to ask if there are any thoughts or questions. I mean, I know I have criticized certain strands of Islamic practice. I don't mean to diminish people's sincerity, their sincere desire to, engage with, this deen. But I think that there are options for us, and there are some options we have removed from the table we need to bring back to our consciousness. So any quick questions or comments at this point?
I'm Sufi. Is there any specific example of this Sufism? Maybe like secularism.
I'm coming to those in the rest of the presentation, but I wanted to stop in case there are questions about what I've said so far.
So
I have much to say about those Sufi movements. Yeah, many examples, hundreds of examples. So we won't cover all of them, but yeah.
Because here we have the Tabligh.
Yeah, you have many.
The tarikats.
Yeah, you have many.
Closely related to Sufism.
Yeah. Yeah, but I won't tell you about the ones you have because you know them better than me. But we do know that Professor Khairuddin Junaid's recent work wrote a wonderful article, Sufi Warriorism.
Contemplating Sufism.
Well, Sufi Warriorism, the
yeah.
article,
Yeah.
and then of course this book about Sufism. So he could tell you all about the ones in Southeast Asia against the Dutch, against the British, etc. But I will tell you about some of the other ones outside of this context in the next section, which I'm happy to go to if there are no other questions. Yeah.
One question. My name is Fidaus. I want to ask about regarding the Sufi pessimism.
Regarding
The Sufi pessimism regarding for the Palestine issues and Iran, is it more because of geopolitical reason rather than spiritual or
Yes.
political reason?
Yes, when I said theology or history, I don't want to go, that's not the subject, that's the framework, but that's not the subject of the talk. So I didn't want to go too deeply into it at the introduction, but it's a very important question that you're raising that I was trying to highlight with, is it theology or spirituality or history? And what I mean by history is the actual concrete circumstances, politically, geopolitically, economically, etc., socially, that go into really what I would say fundamentally the question of sovereignty. Is there a Muslim sovereign nation in the region of West Asia? I would say, apart from Iran, no. And they fought for their sovereignty by having a revolution to throw off the Shah, who was a Western, made Iran a Western vassal state, overthrew their own original democratically elected government because under Mossadegh they wanted to nationalize the oil as a sovereign decision for the benefit of the Iranian people. So that was toppled with a coup by MI6, CIA, very well-known case, and the Shah was installed as an autocratic, authoritarian dictator who oppressed his people. They became sovereign because of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Whatever you want to say about it, that's what they won for themselves. And as a result, they have been made to pay for 47 years for acting in a sovereign way to try and neutralize this example, to neutralize their effect in the region, and to neutralize and stop and punish them for their solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. They never gave up on the Palestinian people, and as a result, they have been made to suffer. So the real point is that sovereignty is a precondition for really fulfilling a Muslim life, i.e. that's why it has to be an anti-colonial and anti-imperial form of Islam, because otherwise we are subordinate within a world system that prevents us from making the sovereign choices that 99% of all Muslims want to free the Palestinian people. 99% of Muslims want to be in solidarity with their other brothers and Muslim countries and cooperate and see an ummah actually come into being. Not the OIC as just a kind of, UN-like sort of thing that hasn't accomplished much, and we were talking before that the OIC actually was organized and developed because of Palestine and because of the burning of the Mimbar in Al-Aqsa, and they came together because this was a present danger to the Muslim world in the holy city. So this is what is, I think, a crucial question, is the sovereignty of Muslim societies. That is then fundamentally that they are able to resist. But the thing that we don't recognize and understand is that's not going to happen without the resistance that Iran did, and they've suffered. They have suffered, but they are proud to continue to do that. I know there are many in the society, it's divided. Not everybody is in the streets every night for 70 nights, but enough of them are that they are keeping their revolution alive, right? So I would say that's more important than the theology. Right? Their theology changed because they needed it to change if they were to free themselves. They had to stop thinking that we're just going to wait passively for the Mahdi. We have to do something to prepare for that. And so they did. So I think that's one of the differences that we have to concern ourselves with. So anyway, just to come to this then, and then move as quickly as possible. Yeah, I should. Thank you. And I'll try and cover this because probably this is more understood in this room. If I was speaking to a Western audience, I need to explain more about how their tradition of Orientalism and scholarship and their construction of an idea of Sufism and popular culture and all these things has created it as a spirituality. But there's two key things that I want to mention, is that they have certain kind of intellectual orientations that have studied mystical traditions of all these different religions have said, oh, Sufism is like these other kind of spiritual traditions within other religions, and that they're all one and they're all the same. And this is a very attractive, kind of idea. And I fundamentally believe in some sense that all the religions are in the path of haqq, but obviously this is a Muslim, tradition. You cannot understand Sufism without putting it in its context as coming from Islam. And so they have tried to kind of suggest that the origins of it come from outside Islam. Either it's Zoroastrian and Hindu kind of contact in the East, or it's Eastern Christian monks in the Near East, Syria, Egypt, etc., and that these spiritual traditions have informed Islam have informed Sufism with the idea that Sufism is somehow inorganic, inauthentic, or extraneous to mainstream Islam. And why? Because Islam is a religion of the law. And we know the Islamic law is very important. It's very important and significant, but they've set up a kind of opposition between the spiritual and the legal, which comes purely from Christian theological orientations. With Paul, letter to Corinthians, the letter killeth, but the spirit gives life. We don't have to. This is what distinguishes Christianity, is that we don't have to follow the Hebrew, Judaic, halakhic law, right, of Judaism. There is a spiritual meaning to it that transcends it, and they think of Judaism and Islam as religions of the law, as carnal religions that don't have spirit. And so this feeds into the idea that the Orientalists and scholars, even if they're secular, have, which is that their norm for understanding a religion is Christianity, and their idea of it being spiritual as opposed to legal and social and political is fundamental to then how they framed Sufism as extraneous to what's fundamentally Islam and Muslim. And we know, of course, this is incorrect. The other key component for them of characterizing Sufism is its apolitical character. Because it is a rejection of the world, it's a renunciation of the world, it renders unto Caesar what is Caesar's, okay? Again, the Christian kind of idea. And so therefore it is spiritual versus the political, and there is a dichotomy between the two, and that boundary is divided, right? And this allows Sufism to then be adopted and to be allowable in the global war on terror as the good kind of Islam, and also to be attractive to Western society that is seeking some kind of form of spirituality. Sufism can be appropriate and appropriated out of Islam, right? Now, obviously, we agree with that, but I think the way to kind of confront this is to go back into Islamicate history of Sufism and think about a few key points. I won't go through all of that because you all know this in this kind of an audience. I don't need to, but I will just say that it's a very interesting phrase. Ali al-Hujwiri, who wrote the first Persian treatise on Sufism called Kashf al-Mahjub, said something interesting about how he framed the history of Sufism. He said, in the beginning, it was a reality without a name. Now, speaking in the 4th century of Islam, it is a name without a reality, right? So it's like, okay, it's already become something kind of normativized. And that's interesting and important, because what it shows is that already from a fairly early period, this idea of the boundary between the spiritual, mystical versus the legal and the orthodox has already really, if it ever existed, has fallen apart, even in contemporary writings. And so I'd say, what is the beginning point for Sufis? And unlike the Orientalists, who are always looking for the origin, I would say, what's the beginning for our analysis and for our story? And I think, we've already sort of covered this kind of point, but is to look at how tasawwuf emerged in Muslim communities everywhere across where Muslim lands, and there may have been interactions with other spiritual and religious traditions, but that's how the whole tradition itself also grew in kalam, in fiqh, is in relation to the fact that Muslims were living in a plural society and that there already were established religious traditions that they had to engage with and mark where's the boundaries, and this was a stimulus for how Islam developed as a whole social culture, right, and civilization. That is something that happens through historical interaction between religions interconfessionally. And then also is what I just mentioned, is that there developed a Sufism of the ulama scholars. So it's not like there's this fundamental boundary between the spiritual and the legal, but it was something that was recognized early on. And of course, I would emphasize that we know when we study that there are many aspects of tasawwuf and Sufism that come organically and directly from the Prophet ﷺ's example, from concepts in the Quran that later Sufi thinkers and mystics developed. And so to say it is somehow out of Islam or in conflict with what is normative for Islam is, of course, a false impression. However, unfortunately, it is an impression that many Muslims now have because of what has happened in the colonial and post-colonial era, is that Muslims have been cut off from many of their previous traditions, from their history. They have accepted this idea that Sufism was a kind of like apolitical, spiritual, or superstitious thing that would retard the progress of Muslim societies, and therefore there were discourses in modernist Muslim circles and in Salafist circles that de-emphasized or were hostile to Sufism, such that what was once, in the medieval period that I study, the predominant orientation devotionally for Muslims, not that everybody was a mystic, but that everybody was connected with a Sufi order, in some ways. On Thursday night, they go to zikr or they go visit the sheikh, and it's just part of your fabric of your practice, right? Social life, yeah. So we have been convinced that there is, both because of Orientalist scholarship, Westernization, and colonialism, as well as the response to it from within Muslim society, that has de-emphasized the resources of Sufism for modern contemporary Muslims in many ways. And so I want to come then to the examples that you had asked, Sophie, that what are some of the examples of Sufis and active political confrontation and even military struggle, jihad, and ghaza. We have such a history here. So there's a hadith, for example, from the Prophet ﷺ, the fighter in Allah's path is the one who strives against his lower self, the nafs, in obedience to Allah. And then, of course, there is the hadith about the lesser and the greater jihad that became extremely popular during the era of the global war on terrorism, because it was it was interpreted as a depoliticizing orientation to say, okay, we should be focusing just on the greater jihad of working on ourselves, not this, lesser jihad. It was a way of trying to reframe what had happened during the 9/11 attacks, and mostly by diasporic Muslims or Muslims in majority Muslim countries that wanted to have some kind of dialogue with the West and repair through diplomatic and interfaith dialogue. It was a technique that actually depoliticizes Sufism and tries through that to depoliticize, Islam on some sort of level. So Sufism could be seen as an antidote, the kind of mark of the good Muslims, right? But if we go back into history and we look at the 11th and 12th century Sufi tabaqat literature, the compendiums of biographical notices of early Sufis, like Farid ad-Din Attar's Tazkiratul Awliya or Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani's Hilyatul Awliya, if we look back at those early reports, we find that there are very many occasions of early Sufis, people who are identified as connected with the Sufi tradition, who were engaged in ghaza, in the ribats on the frontiers, and that they were mujahideen, and they were described, and that this was spiritualized as an ascetic kind of practice of sacrifice, to go and abandon everything behind, to risk your life, to extend the frontiers of Islam, and to combat, to expand, Muslim sovereignty. Not forcible conversion. Now, it turns out that many of these mujahideen, these Sufis, Sufi mujahids, and we know, as is the case in this part of the world, that merchants and Sufis were the ones who spread this religion. Same in actually many parts of South Asia, same in the Central Asia, and we have wonderful scholarship by people like Devin Davis about the conversion of the Golden Horde, the Mongol, ulus that governed in the western parts of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, in today's Russia and Eastern Europe, that they were converted through Sufi kinds of exemplars, right? Who went beyond the frontiers of Islam. People like Farid ad-Din Ganji Shakar, the Chishti sheikh, who brought Islam to much of parts of the Indian subcontinent, and of course, as I was just alluding to, the Hadrami Sufis of Yemen, who came to this part of the world, right, in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. So Harry Neal has done some studies of these early biographies and said that there is an intimate connection between Sufism and ghaza or jihad in the early period, using these hagiographical notices and studying them. And I would argue as well, the Ghazis and Ottomans in Anatolia and the Balkans are absolutely crucial. You cannot understand Ottoman history and its success in the Balkan regions, without understanding the Bektashis and even later also Rifa'is. All these Sufi orders were fundamental to spreading Islam, and you could come up with many other examples. But the last example that I want to give here is the Safavi Sufi order before it turned to full kind of Shiism, which is something that happened under Shah Ismail after his defeat at the Battle of Chaldiran. He was not able to continue his conquests against the Ottomans. He was defeated. So he had to build a state in the boundaries of what is basically kind of greater Iran. And at that point, he decided to adopt Imami Shiism as the state religion. And in fact, he even forcibly converted, people to it. And that's when Iran becomes majority Shii. And it wasn't before, right? But his father, who was head of the Safavi Sufi order, was criticized because he was training his Turkmen Sufi murids, making weapons, shields, swords, and he was being criticized by others saying, hey, you're Sufis, you're supposed to just be contemplating Allah, what are you doing getting involved in these kinds of things? And he said, because we are the ones who are most ready to engage in the lesser jihad because we have completed the inner jihad, the jihad al-nafs. So now that we have completed that task, we are the ones who are ready, right? So he reversed that same hadith that is used to accept us from public commitments, the political, the fighting, on behalf of Islam, that, it's the lesser jihad. He turned it around and said, the Sufis first, once they have completed, now it is obligatory, and in fact, they are the best ones to go perform the jihad because they have completed. And they cite and quote also in this context the example of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anh, right? That the Battle of Khaybar, where an opponent spat at him and he was about to slay him, and he stopped and said, and the person was surprised, you had me, you could have killed me. I said, yes, but it would have been from my ego out of anger, not from, true disinterested desire to fulfill the jihad, right, in the proper way. And so they use this also to say, well, we must be like that, right? We have to discipline ourselves, but then we can be great warriors like Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anh, right? So this is very important to understand that this has a long history of active engagement in the pre-modern period. Now, we're going long. I don't want to, this is just a tekke in Bosnia, so just an example of this is actually Sarasaltuk, supposedly his tomb. I say supposedly because there's 5 or 6 other places in the Balkans and in Turkey that are Sarasaltuk's tomb, but it shows the importance of how Muslim societies connected themselves through great Sufi Ghazi warriors to being part of the rest of the Muslim world, right? It's how they understood a connection as a tangible link to the rest of the ummah, right? And this is important to recognize. Now, at the risk of going too long, I'll just say 1 or 2 things about Tariqa Sufism, which is that the organizational capacity of the Sufi Turuq, the orders or the brotherhood, is very important to recognize in why and how they were so capable of performing anti-colonial resistance in the more modern times. So I'm not going to cover all of the components. We could talk a little bit more about it, but the main point out of this is the murid-murshid relationship that becomes very deep during the era of Tariqa Sufism, is that is a bond of intimate connection at the psychological level, at the social level, at the material level, and the spiritual level that is the anchor for the wider organization of the Sufi Turuq that allowed mobilization. So when Haidar is able to say, well, we can move to this, it's because he had a disciplined following of his murids who were going to follow his leadership and his example in a disciplined sort of way. So that is a capillary, social capillary of power, right, that exists, that can be turned to political purpose. And this happened, of course, we know the great example of the Safavid Sufi order is that it ended up becoming, kind of the Safavid state and the Safavid dynasty in Iran. And so they were just the most successful of the Sufi groups during that period. Like there was so many other groups and they were all doing similar things. Even the Naqshbandis, for example, Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar was essentially the ruler of Samarkand, for example, right? And it wasn't seen as incompatible with his role as a Sufi sheikh as well, right? So there was an intimate relationship. And I'll just move to a point that I like to make, and that this is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in Ibn Khaldun, is because he provides, in a way, you might say, an Islamicate-based social theory based on Islamic history that he studied for thinking about how do social forces like this come into being. And even though, it's interesting, he didn't himself discuss the Sufi Turuq himself, but his concept of the Asabiyya and the intimate relationship I was mentioning that is the heart of Tariqa Sufism as the bond between Murshid and Murid is, you could describe it as Asabiyya, being mobilized, enhanced, and then deployed in social action when it does take place. But I want to come finally. Yeah.
He wrote a treatise on Sufism.
Oh yeah, he did. Yes, but he didn't talk about this. He was engaging in other discussion and controversy. And there's more work to be done. And I would like to think about this. And maybe this is a good group to think about. Why is it? So this is also a fundamental question for me, and I'm trying to use Ibn Khaldun a little bit to understand it, but that's more from this organizational perspective of the social. But why and how is it that the mystical and spiritual discourses that are most advanced about why we must, free ourselves from dunyawi kind of preoccupations, that you would think leads to being apolitical in the framework of the spiritual versus the political. How is it and why is it that the people who are trained in this discipline of removing yourself from dunya and the temptations and being involved in the discipline of one's own nafs, that is often seen as very introverted and self-directed and involved, so that you can make a connection by freeing yourself, make a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the whole spiritual Sufi path. How and why is it that they were the most advanced when it came to confronting the problem of foreign occupation and invasion and fighting the colonizing powers, because this is the other part of their history in the more modern period, is anti-colonial Sufi jihads. And there's so many examples, and you were just telling me about the examples here, Sufi warriorism and all of that in Southeast Asia. But some of the other examples that, of course, you may know about is you're thinking about, the Mahdi in Sudan. It's built upon a Sufi kind of order and practice that then kind of claims, and I think very often the claims for the Mahdi or Mahdism is in fact actually a claim for contesting sovereignty and power in today's world. That's why a Mahdi comes, is because we need to free ourselves. So that's one important point. Other is, of course, the Naqshbandiya of the Caucasus. You'll be very kind of aware of Sheikh Imam Shamil and many others in their resistance against the Russian Empire in the Caucasus, in Dagestan, in Chechnya, in Shishan. The Sufi warriorism we already talked about. Emir Abdul Qadir, a Sufi in Algeria, who fought over 10 years against the French in their first attempts to conquer Algeria, right? And even more, I've learned a little bit about the Ar-Rahmaniya tariqa, and in particular, Lala Fatma Nsumer, who was the daughter of a sheikh of the Ar-Rahmaniya, who led resistance rebellions against the French after Sufi Abdul Qadir had to make the surrender agreement after 10, 12 years of fighting the French. He goes into exile. She takes up the banner and calls people from the zawiyas and from the ribats to use those Sufi spaces for organizing continuing militant resistance against the French colonialists. So we have an incredible heritage, and of course you would be aware of the West African Sufis and the jihads of Uthman Dan Fodio and Haj Omar Tal in the West African context. Even you could say, of course, Ahmadu Bamba and the Murids, who to this day preserved even in the post-colonial period a kind of almost semi-autonomous kind of zone where they govern, and have a kind of sovereignty over, because they had fought for it against the French. So that even in the post-colonial Senegalese state, they had to respect that the Murids have their kind of zone, that is under, because they fought for their kind of liberation against the French. And of course the Sanusiya order, like everyone knows that Omar Mukhtar fought against the Italians, but we don't emphasize that he was a Sufi. And it was the Sanusi tariqa that was the basis for the anti-colonial resistance against the Italians. And then finally, I would say, back to our present relevant context of Gaza, is understanding that Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, the Qassam brigades, are named after him, the preacher who fought and rose up against the British during the Mandate period and was assassinated and killed and murdered and is a martyr of the Palestinian liberation cause, was a Sufi again. So it is inseparable from understanding the anti-colonial, and then we could come up with many, many other examples from around the Muslim world.
Al-Banna, the Muslim Brotherhood, is also a Sufi.
Yes, again, that's right.
From a Sufi order.
That's right. So what I would, so I guess the point here is that the authentic anti-colonial tradition in Muslim societies has come from Sufism. It has not, in fact, actually come at all. And here's Sheikh Shamil and Emir Abdul Qadir. It has not. It has not come.
We have a Shamil.
Oh, okay.
Shamil.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Well, you're named after a very noble. And I would say that this goes beyond just Muslims confronting colonialism in their homelands, but that also in the Atlantic world, Muslims who were enslaved and taken from West Africa to societies of the New World in the Caribbean and in South America were again those who were the most active in anti-slave, in rebellions against slavery, in slave revolts and rising up, and that again, it's almost never discussed. But you cannot, I think, understand these without understanding the character of West African Islam, which was so immersed in Sufi orientations, and we could turn to Brother Bilal Butchware's scholarship about the walking Quran that studies the Sufi anti-slavery and anti-colonial movements of the late 18th and early 19th century, to understand that that tradition is part of the 30% or so of West African Muslims who were enslaved and brought. 30% of the population of the African diaspora that was enslaved in the New World were Muslims, and the Islam that they knew and understood, I would argue, can't be understood without looking at Sufism.
Maybe a question.
Yeah.
When you say about the anti-slavery of the Sufism,
Yeah.
how do they view the slave from the new world, the new colonized era, with the slavery in the Muslim world itself? We have the slave.
Yeah, that's right.
How do they view that in terms of ideologically?
Well, the Butch.
They won't resist the.
Uthman Danfodio and Haj Umar Tal do not seem to necessarily have abolished enslavement, which is, of course, part of Islamic law, and they they wanted to free themselves from the slavery, but they didn't abolish as a. Firstly, of course, they also didn't have the same kind of states that we have, and so on. But they really de-emphasized it and combated it because at that time the principal enslaving mechanism was the Atlantic slave trade that was taking place. But it still obviously remains as a possibility, not for Muslims, right? You're not supposed to enslave Muslims, but the non-Muslim kind of population, there still may have been some, kind of continuing possibility and tradition of that. But according to Bilal Ware, in Senegambia, at the turn of in the early 20th century, there were movements that actually made it as a kind of demand or a goal to abolish slavery among who are Sufi Muslims. So you have a range of possibilities. They were the most kind of advanced in rethinking how we should apply Islamic law to the present circumstances and actually overturn slavery of any kind.
Because they view the different tradition of between those two, between the Muslim tradition and the Western tradition of slavery, is a bit different.
Definitely, it is totally different. It wasn't a racialized slavery. It was, based on kind of confession, and it was also usually domestic slavery or also military, right? Like we had the Turkic slave soldiers, right, in the past, the Mamluks, which is again a very odd form of slavery where these are the rulers of society, right? Like, it's just a kind of interesting institution that doesn't fit the paradigms of social subordination, but actually of an exclusive sort of caste that is separate from the civilian society, or domestic slavery. So we're talking small-scale household slavery, not the kind of proto-capitalist form of plantation slavery and a whole economy built on a racialized system of mass enslavement as part of the major production process. So there's a difference between what you could call, and scholars talk about this in the historiography.
Jonathan Brown,
Yeah, well, I mean, he has a whole book on it. Yeah, a very interesting kind of study. But there's a difference, you would say, broadly in the historiography, that is the historians' discussions of the institution of slavery in different societies, that they talk about slave societies versus societies with slavery. And the societies with slavery are many, like almost universal in human history. There have been some form of social subordination, of being unfree, usually in a domestic kind of context, usually prisoners of war. This is the kind of way in which it happened, versus slave societies that are actually very few in history, where you cannot describe the society and the political economy of those societies without referring to the institution of slavery as the dominant mode of organizing labor. That's the difference. And there are very few of those. Like Roman Empire was a slave society. They had mass enslavement in the agricultural kind of plantations that they had. And then modern European colonial society and the settler colonies that were established in the Atlantic world and elsewhere, were principally also slave societies. But they're a departure from the main kind of experience in human societies of enslavement, right? They are very kind of significant as like a, and so what we had is that we have these revolts, and I won't go through them too much, but just to say, you know, the Gris was a kind of amulet, and you know, in the Haiti revolt, they talk about people being given these as part of the revolt against slavery in Haiti in their revolution. And these are amulets that, you know, come from the Muslim Mande West African kind of communities. And the biggest slave revolt in Brazil was led by Muslim ulama who were Sufis again. And the Bahia revolts of the 1830s, massive revolts. You know, these are some of the leaders of the Haitian. But this is an example of the gris-gris, these amulets. They always talk about it as voodoo, as a synthetic, you know, of West African and new religions kind of amalgam. But these are used in West African Sufism as a protection, right? Muska, ta'viz, you know, these things, I don't know if people use them here, but, you know, very common. And this is what you find in the gris-gris. Like, so this is, you know, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, right? Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, an-Nabi. This is what's written and put in them. So when people have talked about these important slave revolts, they have very seldom connected them to Islam as a form of resistance. And even if they do mention that there might be some connection, very seldom do they say this is coming out of the Sufi political kind of resistance. And so that's just what I would like to kind of conclude on, is reviving Sunni political spirituality, right? So we have to write this history of Muslim anti-colonialism through Sufism. And the other point to make is, coming back to some remarks I made, is that Salafism, Wahhabism, has almost no tradition of anti-colonial, anti-imperial resistance. What it does have is an awful lot of collaboration with the British colonists elsewhere, and that they have continued that even in the era after British colonialism, with collaboration of the geopolitical goals of US empire. Syria had a supposedly so-called revolution recently. We were also told we should be very happy for the Syrian people. What has it done to the cause of Palestine? Has this new Muslim state fired even one bullet against the occupiers who have taken their land, Syrian land, in the past year and a half? No. So if we are to look to an authentic tradition of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism in Sunni Islam, we have to look to our spiritual traditions and understand that the division between spirituality and the political is a false Western one that comes from other sources. And we have to recover this tradition ourselves of doing both the jihad al-nafs as our preparation for jihad al-akbar, to free ourselves. And so I think this is part of a wider discussion of where religion is often diminished as an important contributor to the freedom struggle of people because of the Marxist Western tradition, where it's been characterized as opiate of the masses, which is something that comes entirely out of the Western historical experience of the domination by the church. Islam never had a church. There is no institutional organization that speaks for Muslims altogether. It is something that emerges from the consensus of our culture, our history, our tradition, and it doesn't recognize this difference as a radical one between the spiritual and the political, but rather these are integrated in the whole human, and that is the new human. Fanon or Shariati, who knows who it was, who was asking us to form. And so inshallah, we can take the resources from our own tradition to build our own forms of authentic life, but to do so, we have to have sovereignty, and that means that it is always an anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggle until the world is reshaped. So inshallah, we can contribute to that. And I thank you very much for your patience. And if you have questions about the second part, or we have some discussion about it, I would love to hear from you, your thoughts. So jazakallah.